Hi, class. We're going to start the lecture on Chapter 2, an overview of communication development. I'm going to try and keep this one to 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll do at least one more before we meet for our second class session on Zoom. Again, I'm going to remind you I keep looking away because my notes are on a separate screen over here. If you remember, I told you before the reason we are going to discuss what is typical communication development is because before we can diagnose disorder in the area of communication in any kind, we have to know what the typical expectations are for the development of communication. So just a couple terms to start with. The first is communicative competence. And competence is the knowledge and implicit awareness that the speaker possesses and utilizes to communicate effectively within that shared language. So, for example, to understand utilizes, I had a student a few years ago who was voluntarily mute. Now, we know from hearing recordings of her speaking at home and overhearing her speaking with peers at school that she had the ability to use spoken language and use it very well. But she didn't really have communicative competence because she would not utilize that knowledge that she had to be effective in her communication at school. So, communicative competence then is much more than just having precise articulation, correct use of syntax, spoken grammar, just to remember what that means. Syntax is spoken grammar. Having a good vocabulary. It's the sum of all of that, as well as the ability to give and receive feedback in order to monitor and modify our messages. It's also the ability to assess each communicative situation and apply the rules that would govern the social piece of language, that language pragmatics. We communicate to make contact, to reach out to others, to satisfy our needs, to reveal feelings, to share information, to accomplish a host of other purposes. So we need to have competence in each of those areas. Communicative performance is the actual speech behavior and the extent to which speech contains performance errors. So, in typical speech, a typical communicator, now not talking about someone that has something that we're going to identify as disorder, but just a typical developing communicator, we make a speech blunder in 1 out of every 10 words in typical communicative exchanges. So, communicative competence covers 2 different aspects of language, the linguistic aspects and the pragmatic aspects. And each of those has 4 components that I'll go over right now. In linguistic competence, the first component is phonological competence. Anytime you hear the word phonological, you know we're talking about sounds, the sounds of the language. So, phonological competence is the ability to recognize and produce the phonemes or the sounds of a language. We learn that the sounds, the sounds of language as infants and toddlers, even before we can connect them all together into speech. We learn to distinguish very small changes in sound production that result in very big changes in meaning. So, for example, the words pan, P-A-N, and ban, B-A-N, those 2 words are only different when we produce them phonologically by voicing on the first consonant. The p or p is not voiced. The b is voiced. That's the only difference between those 2 words, but obviously the 2 words have very different meaning. We have a difficult time as adults learning the sounds of a second language if those sounds are not in the linguistic inventory or the phonological inventory of our own language. So, for example, a Spanish speaker learning English may have a difficult time distinguishing and then producing a difference between the English sounds th, or let me say it with my voice, th, and d. There is no TH sound in Spanish, and the closest sound to that voiced TH is the soft D of Spanish. So they may have difficulty producing a difference between the words there and dare, or the words 15 and 50, and that's a difference of that long vowel sound. Um, they may, as they're learning English, have a difficult time distinguishing, but mostly producing those words. Even though they may produce the words in a way that sounds incorrect to an English only listener, we understand their speech based on the context. Um, the next competence within linguistic competence is grammatical competence. This is the ability to recognize and produce the syntactic structures of the language. So, understanding correct word order, understanding those morphological structures. And if you remember, morphemes are those smallest units of language that contain meaning. So, the plural S ending, the ED ending, the ING ending. When I'm trying to speak Spanish, I freeze when it comes to the verbs. I haven't yet learned the past tense, the present tense forms of verbs. But when we're listening to us, someone speak to us, and they have slight errors in their spoken grammar, we typically, it doesn't interfere with our understanding of what they're trying to say based on context, because there are other contextual cues. We have that linguistic intuition within our own language. The third area of competence is lexical competence, and it's the ability to recognize and produce the conventional words or conventional vocabulary of a language. Think of the word lexicon as being synonymous with the word dictionary. So it's the sum of the recognizable words in a language. We can also use it to refer to the sum of the recognizable words in a field of study. So in this class, you're learning the lexicon for speech pathology. Because babies, this is just an amazing part of development, because babies recognize their own names by approximately 4 months of age. They use that knowledge to learn other words. So they hear their name and it captures their attention, and they're able to then reason intuitively that the next set of sounds they hear must represent a different word. For them, probably a new word. In normal development with a neurotypical child, comprehension always precedes or comes before production. We always understand before we're able to use something. And the same is true with children and their communicative development. Children will always learn new vocabulary in context. They don't just learn a new word because they hear it without any context around it. And there are visual cues that also come along with that auditory production. The fourth piece of linguistic competence is discourse competence. This is the ability to recognize and produce coherent, cohesive speech events, the understanding and ability to use language in a larger context. So, understanding and using representational words throughout discourse, understanding what they represent, understanding that those representations must be shared. Also, the topics are introduced sufficiently. Changes in topics are handled in a way that both participants in the communicative act are on the same page. In other words, discourse competence is not just the ability to be successful with isolated units of language, but with bigger language events. It's a bigger piece of discourse. So, understanding, for example, the meaning of pronouns. It's not uncommon for a person with a language disorder to not attach meaning to pronouns. So, they either misuse them, use he for she or she for he, or they always use the proper pronoun or the proper noun, and they don't use pronouns at all. One of the ways I see this play out, and this is not because of a disorder, but in student writing that I collect, and I'm talking now at the university level, often I will see students respond to a question or describing, for example, describing a video that they've watched, and they never introduce me to their pronouns. So if I ask a question, what did the subject of this video do in this situation? Instead of starting with the child in the video or the speech therapist in the video, they start with he did this or she did this and not introduce me to those pronouns. That's in writing, that's an issue with competence of using of this larger speech event or larger language event. In the area of pragmatic competence, we also have 4 components. The first is function, and these overlap a bit, so bear with me on these explanations. The first is functional competence. It's the ability to recognize and use a variety of language functions. We discussed in one of our lectures from chapter 1, Halliday's 7 functions of language. So those included tasks like requesting and commenting and reasoning. So functional competence is the ability to use language for functional purposes. The second is sociolinguistic competence. This is the ability to recognize and apply socially appropriate language. So using the expected politeness markers or knowing your audience and adapting your tone and structure appropriately. In the book, this is called code switching. So if I'm going to explain, for example, the same basic procedure to a group of adults and then also to a group of 5 or 6-year-olds, I'm going to choose different words and different language, different sentence structure. So I'm going to switch codes based on who my audience is. Now you're also going to hear the term code switching, not in this chapter, but you'll hear that term applied to a situation where a speaker might mix 2 languages. Sometimes, like for example, with Spanish and English, we would call using Spanglish. That's code switching. You hear it a lot in a person speaking a foreign language, a language other than English, but then using proper names of things and using the English names for those things. That's a bit of code switching. So that's completely fine. The third area of competence, pragmatic competence, is interactional competence. This is the ability to interpret and then use accepted standards for interaction. So correctly interpreting a communicative situation and applying the appropriate rules of interaction. So for example, I would use different language during an interview versus teaching elementary students versus teaching university students versus being in an authoritative position or at lunch with my peers. So interpreting all of those situations, all of those contexts correctly and using the appropriate rules of engagement. Things like initiating conversation, making appropriate eye contact, using correct body language and correct proximity. The fourth is cultural competence. This is the ability to interpret and utilize culturally appropriate behavior. Now, that could be microculture. For example, some families have agreed upon communicative norms that they use within their family that another family might not judge as appropriate, but within their family, they're completely appropriate. Or it could be a bigger cultural issue. An example I'll give of that is for any of you who've ever worked at Disneyland. And I worked there an eternity ago, but one thing I noticed even working there was that often Japanese tourists, when they would come and want to speak to a cast member, stood very close. And as a typical American, it would be like, wow, back off, kind of give me my space. But it's culturally appropriate in Japan in some instances to be much closer. And part of that, I'm sure, is because they have some more crowded situations, for example, on subways and, in some business settings. And the same thing would be true with us traveling to Japan. We need to know what the cultural norms are before we kind of offend anybody by using gestures or speaking in situations where we don't understand what the cultural norms are for communication. Okay, so we're going to discuss the foundations for communicative competence, those things that need to happen before necessarily actual words come into play. Before we get into that, I want to put in a plug for a course here at Cal State Fullerton that is not one of your required courses. But it's a course that I took myself just about 10 years ago and found of incredible value and wish that I had taken much earlier in my career. And that course is Human Growth and Development. I wish they would make it a required course. So if you have any room in your schedule, or if you have gen ed that it may apply for, I'm not sure about that. I can't recommend this more strongly. Human Growth and Development. I took it through the Child and Adolescent Study Department, but it does cover um, growth and development through um, old age. I took it with Sharon Wilmer. I'm not sure if she is still teaching or not, but if you could get it with her, all the better. It is an excellent course for understanding a lot of what we're going to talk about now for the rest of this lecture and well beyond that. Things that you can definitely apply no matter what setting you work in as a speech pathologist. So, infancy, the three most significant phases of infancy. So, setting that foundation for communicative competence. The first is the ability to attend to a social partner. This happens from about birth to age 6 months. We see this emerging and strengthening. Now, I'm going to give you a lot of age ranges over the next end of this lecture and into the next one. Just understand that children are variable, and so these are age ranges that we expect things to fit in. They are not set in stone and absolutes. So, birth to age 6 months, we expect to see the increasing ability to attend to a social partner. And what that means is, well, we already learned in a last previous lecture that the sound that infants favor is the sound of speech. So it's during this period that they also learn that there's value in attending to social interactions. They lengthen the amount of time they spend engaging in social exchanges. They are hopefully rewarded with positive responsiveness from a caregiver, and because of that reward, then they increase the length of time that they are attending to that social situation, and it becomes a cycle. So, attending to the interaction, getting a positive response, lengthening the time of attention, getting more positive responses. And these are simple things like you may have an infant that's sitting in a little child seat, and you get down on their level and they look up at you and change the expression on their face, and you start talking to them. Hi, oh, I love that smile you're giving me. And they can hear your tone of voice. We already know they love to attend to human speech. And so they look for longer and they might smile longer and you talk some more. And this cycle goes on. They're being rewarded with warm, friendly faces and sounds to that attention, that attention with a social partner. The next significant phase of infancy is joint attention. This is the hallmark of the phase from 6 to 12 months of age. And I think if you remember, I told you that part of my job, or my whole job this semester in my school district employment, is the infant and preschool assessment team. Joint attention is the first thing we look for in our really young kids. So it refers to an infant's ability to navigate its attention between an object of interest and another person. So it could be things like attending to a picture book with a caregiver, or playing with bubbles in the bathtub and looking up to the caregiver to blow the bubbles again. Playing with a toy that must be manipulated. So the adult has a wind up toy and they put it down and the child pays attention as the toy moves across the table, and then it stops. And instead of reaching for the toy, the child looks to the adult. to get that toy back. So they may exchange glances back and forth. Sorry about that. I don't know if my computer gave you a glitch, but it did for me right then, so I signed back on. Lost my place because of that. Sustained episodes of joint attention are very significant in the child's acquisition of new words. It generally involves not only caregiver speech, but also the nonverbal aspects of communication that happen at the same time. So, pointing to an object, handing the child an object, and some other way directing their attention back and forth to the object. Or you think of maybe looking at that picture book, having the adult pointing to pictures in the book and directing the child's attention in that way. And then also the reverse of that, the child then finding some ways to direct the caregiver's attention to what they're doing. A term that comes in line with this joint attention is the term intersubjective awareness. And it's the recognition that you are sharing mental focus on some external object or action with another person. So infants in this period develop the ability to understand that another person's pointing or showing cues are intentional, and they are meant to generate shared interest in something. They also then they learn to use those cues themselves for very intentional communication. So the child may learn to pick up that object and put it out and show it to an adult. That's an intentional communication. The child's attempts can be judged as intentional if they meet certain criteria. The first of those criteria is the infant can follow a person's line of regard or gesture from a distance. Now, this is not like an across the room distance, but if the child is sitting in a high chair at the table and the adult is sitting at the table also, and the adult points to something a little farther and the infant then looks in that direction, we know they're following the line of regard. The second is an infant can use their own gestures or voice to direct another person's attention to an object of interest. So this is a real typical example of this is the child sitting in the high chair playing with a toy, who then drops the toy and looks over the edge of the high chair and looks back up at the adult. They're doing that to direct the adult's attention to the toy that they've just dropped on the ground, and the adult generally picks it back up and the child drops it again. They're initiating an exchange, and it's a communicative event. The third is the infant can use their voice or gesture to request or to protest. So an object that's of interest. So they are either using voice or gestures, reaching out for something, or objecting. No, I don't want that. Or, that's not the one I want. They're not using those words, but they may use their voice to do that. And then the fourth is the infant can use voice or gesture to get the caregiver to notice him or her. So just trying to get someone's attention, to get that eye contact, either to get comfort or simply just to share attention. The fifth is the infant is able to use voice or gesture to communicate their intentions. So this is the child who wants to get out of that high chair and uses their voice, uses gesture, maybe shaking the tray, letting you know they're done and they want out, as an example. The third important building block here I'm sorry, I've lost the term and I want to make sure I'm using the right term for you. A significant phase of infancy. The third one is the transition, making the transition to spoken language. So from about the age of 1 year and older. Now, some kids make that transition a little earlier, about 9 or 10 months, they start using some real words, and some a little bit later, so 13, 14 months. But anywhere in there is considered a typical age for making the transition to spoken language. So the infant's communicative interactions begin to be laced with real words to represent objects and events. Significant, very significant to language development in this period of infancy are the rituals of infancy. These are everyday tasks like feeding and bathing and dressing. And these are a rich opportunity for infants to hear the patterns of language. Typically, infants hear what we call scripts. Parents, caregivers tend to talk in scripts. And as adults, using the same phrases and patterns of speech over and over again with infants in our care, this helps them not only to build vocabulary, but also to start to recognize the melody of language, the pausing and the phrasing and the inflection changes within discourse. It gives them the opportunity to learn phonotactics. These are the rules and patterns of sounds within their language. The rituals of infancy are also the most frequent opportunities for joint attention. So these are things, for example, babies had a bath and now we've dried them off and we have them up on a changing table or on the bed to get them dressed. So, as a parent or a caregiver, you're probably going to talk through that. So, okay, we need to put your arms in the sleeves. So, oh, let me find your hand, and oh, there it is. Okay, let's find your other arm. And the same thing with their legs. You talk through that. Maybe if you're pulling a little T-shirt over their head, you're like, oh, where's baby? Where's baby? Oh, pop, there you are. We repeat those same patterns over and over again within these rituals of infancy, and it's the beginnings of an infant learning the patterns of language. There's a link in your PowerPoint to a TED Talk by Patricia Kuehl. Now, I put this in there for your benefit. I'm not going to test you on the information in there, but it's a really fascinating TED Talk. So take the 15-20 minutes that you may have to listen to that, because I think it'll help you understand a lot about this, the notion of the child hearing patterns and hearing sounds in infancy. The title of this TED Talk is called The Linguistic Genius of Babies. And Patricia Kuehl's research was done in the first few months of life on the development of speech and language. And what she found is that children are really geniuses at learning language until about age 7. And after that, there's a steady decline in ability. And if you remember, I said in a lecture last week that really by the first, I don't remember the exact age, 5 or 6 months, 4 months, we start discarding the cognitive connections needed for learning sounds that are not in our own language. But there's an even bigger issue of learning language, that up till about age 7, there's tremendous flexibility to learn a second language, and then we begin a steady decline in that. Now, not everybody does that at the same rate. Some people can very easily learn a second language as an adult, and others of us really struggle with that. Most significantly, though, what she found is that in the first 12 months of life, babies are truly, truly citizens of the world, and they can discriminate the sounds of all languages. But that around age 12 months, they become very language bound listeners, and they respond best to the sounds of their native language. Even though we know that babies prefer speech over other sounds, around 12 months, they prefer the speech of their native language to the speech of other languages. So it's just a really fascinating study, and I put it there for your benefit. During this period of infancy, caregiver responsiveness is probably one of the most significant pieces of building communicative competence. Caregivers who are positively responsive cause their children to make more frequent communicative attempts, to engage more frequently in joint attention. They teach them by their positive responses to value communication. Studies have shown that a parent's responsiveness to an infant's attempts at communication have great positive influence on their achievement of other developmental milestones, those associated with language development. So when they say their first words, when they combine, words into two-word sentences, etc. And I'm sure you've all heard of studies done, for example, in orphanages where there are mass numbers of infants. And they usually have pretty delayed language development. Well, part of that is because there are just routines. We come in and everybody gets their diaper changed and everybody gets their clothes put on and everybody gets everything at the same time. And there's very little positive interaction with these mass numbers of children. And because of that, their language development is significantly delayed. Some key indicators of caregiver responsiveness. So, the things that are important for caregivers to do. The first is being able to wait and listen, being a patient and attentive listener, allowing the infant to initiate and progress with that communication. Now, we don't always want to wait for them to initiate it, but allowing them to initiate it sometimes and responding to that initiation, allowing them to complete their message. And I know this sounds kind of funny. We're talking about infants that aren't using real words, but allowing that vocalization to happen and seems like it's at an end before you then respond to it. Demonstrating attention with eye contact and proximity to the child. The second one is following the child's lead, responding verbally and specifically to a child's initiations, avoiding vague responses and responding very specifically to what they're leading you to. So if the child is initiating that play over the edge of the high chair, you say, "Oh, I see you dropped your toy car again. I'm going to pick the car up. Let's put it on." And you use specific language to the event that's happening. You follow their lead in that play for a while. The third is joining in and playing. So build on the child's focus of interest. Don't always dominate the play. So if you prefer, as an adult, playing with the Lego blocks, but your child prefers playing with the cars, play with the cars. It doesn't mean you can't bring the Lego blocks into the play, but focus, build on their area of interest first. Praise that, then bring other things in and join in their play. This is not saying, okay, here are the things you're interested in. Play with those while I go do something else. And the fourth is being face to face. So if the child is playing down on the floor, sit down on the floor with the child. If the child is up in the high chair, sit down in a chair so that you're at eye level with the child. We're busy parents, and often we have children in a situation where we're standing over them and talking down at them and not really joining in their play. It's very important that you're at that level of eye contact. This is where we are going to stop this video. When we start the next one, we will be talking about those major communicative milestones of infancy and toddlerhood. So very specifically what children are achieving at that time. All right, move on to the next one.